I was at my friend's house for the weekend, a break from my usual routine. His family was warm and welcoming, the kind that made you feel at home almost instantly. His mom, in particular, was surprisingly attentive. She wasn't just polite. She had this way of making you feel seen, like you mattered. It wasn't something I thought much about at first, just one of those things you notice and move on from. The house was quiet that day. My friend had stepped out to run some errands, leaving me alone in his room. I passed the time scrolling through my phone, trying to ignore the growing sense of unease that always came with being in someone else's space without them. The room was cozy but unfamiliar, with a faint scent of cologne lingering in the air. Outside the door, the soft hum of activity drifted in, dishes clinking, faint footsteps in the hall. I heard a light knock at the door, and before I could answer, it opened slightly. His mom peeked in, smiling warmly. "I just wanted to check if you needed anything," she said, stepping inside before I could respond. She was carrying a glass of water and a plate of cookies, a small but thoughtful gesture. I thanked her, assuming she'd leave after setting them down. But she didn't. She lingered by the desk, her eyes scanning the room before settling on me. "It's been a while since the house had any real guests," she said, almost wistfully. "It's nice having someone new around." Her tone was casual, but there was something in her voice that I couldn't quite place. I nodded, unsure how to respond. She asked a few more questions. How long I'd known her son, what I was studying, where I was from. The usual small talk, but it felt more personal, like she genuinely cared about the answers. Her gaze never wavered, and for a moment, I felt exposed under her attention. As she talked, I noticed little things about her. How she leaned slightly toward me, the way her eyes lingered on mine longer than necessary. It wasn't overt, not enough to be inappropriate, but it was enough to make me notice. I told myself I was overthinking it, chalked it up to her being friendly. Still, there was an undercurrent I couldn't ignore, something unspoken in the air between us. When she finally stepped back toward the door, she hesitated. "If you need anything else, just let me know," she said, her voice softer this time. Her eyes lingered for a moment, as if waiting for me to say something. I nodded again, unsure what else to do. She smiled a little too knowingly, and then she was gone, leaving me alone with my thoughts and an uneasiness I couldn't shake. The silence felt heavier now, the room more suffocating than before. I tried to focus on anything else, but the image of her standing there, her gaze, her tone, it all played on a loop in my mind. I sat there trying to shake off the strange feeling her visit had left behind. It was just a casual check-in, I told myself. Nothing unusual. But the memory of her lingering presence kept creeping back into my mind. The way she looked at me, the soft inflection in her voice. It was different. I couldn't quite place why it felt off, but it did. Just as I began to lose myself in my phone again, the door creaked open slightly. She was back. This time she didn't knock. She stepped inside with the same easy smile, holding a folded blanket. "I thought you might need this," she said, placing it on the edge of the bed. "Thanks," I replied, keeping my tone casual, though I couldn't ignore how strange it felt for her to return so soon. Instead of leaving, she sat down on the chair by the desk, her hands clasped neatly in her lap. "You must think I'm bothering you," she said with a small laugh, as if reading my mind. "I just don't like leaving guests alone for too long. It feels rude." I shrugged, unsure how to respond. "It's fine. I don't mind." She nodded, her eyes scanning the room briefly before settling on me again. "You seem like a nice kid," she said. "Quiet. Polite. You remind me of someone I used to know." Her words hung in the air for a moment, heavier than they should have been. I didn't ask who she was talking about, but it was clear from her expression that she was lost in a memory. "Sometimes," she continued, "it's nice to be reminded of simpler times. Life gets complicated as you get older." There was something vulnerable in her tone now, something that made me uneasy. She wasn't just making small talk anymore. This felt personal. I shifted in my seat, unsure of what to say. "I'm sorry if that's too much," she said quickly, catching herself. "I guess I just don't get to talk to people like this often." My son's always busy, and well, it's not the same with adults. They're so guarded. Her words were measured, deliberate, and I couldn't shake the feeling that she was leading the conversation somewhere. She leaned forward slightly, her elbows resting on her knees. "What about you?" she asked. "Do you have someone in your life? Someone special?" I hesitated. The question felt too personal, too pointed. "Not really," I replied. She smiled faintly, as if she'd expected that answer. "You're young. You've got time to figure it out," she said. "But don't wait too long. Sometimes, opportunities pass you by before you even realize they were there." Her gaze lingered on me for a moment too long, and I felt a strange mix of discomfort and intrigue. She straightened up, brushing an invisible speck off her lap. "Anyway, I should let you get back to whatever you were doing," she said, standing up. As she walked toward the door, she turned back briefly, her eyes meeting mine. "If you ever feel like talking, I'm a good listener." Then she left, leaving me with a knot of confusion and something else I couldn't quite name. The house had fallen silent again, but the quiet was anything but calming. Her words echoed in my mind, intertwining with the way she'd looked at me before she left. It wasn't just the words themselves. It was how she'd said them, the deliberate pauses, the way her voice softened like she was sharing something meant only for me. I tried to brush it off, but my focus kept drifting back to her. Then, unexpectedly, the door opened once more. This time she didn't knock or make excuses. She stepped inside, shutting the door gently behind her. Her movements were deliberate, almost cautious, and her eyes met mine with an intensity that made my chest tighten. "I just realized," she began, her tone light but tinged with something deeper. "I never asked if you're comfortable here. Is everything okay?" I nodded quickly, my throat dry. "Yeah, everything's fine." She smiled at my response but didn't move toward the door. Instead, she leaned against the desk, crossing her arms loosely. "You don't have to be so formal, you know. It's just me." Her words felt loaded, like there was more she wanted to say but was holding back. The air in the room seemed heavier, and my mind raced to find something to break the tension. But before I could, she took a small step closer. "You're so quiet," she said softly. "It's refreshing. Most people, they don't know when to just listen." I tried to laugh, to say something that might diffuse whatever this was, but the sound caught in my throat. She smiled at my reaction, her eyes studying me closely, as though she was searching for something unspoken. "You know," she began again, her voice dropping slightly, "sometimes when you're around people, you can feel invisible. Like you're just there to fill a role, not really be yourself." Her words hit differently, like she was saying them to me but also to herself. She shifted her weight, and I noticed how close she was standing now. Close enough that the faint scent of her perfume lingered between us. "I don't mean to make you uncomfortable," she said, though her tone didn't suggest she planned on leaving. "It's just nice to feel like someone actually sees you. You know what I mean." I nodded slowly, unsure of what else to do. My mind was a tangle of thoughts. Curiosity, confusion, and something that felt dangerously close to intrigue. She reached out then, her hand brushing against my arm lightly, almost as if by accident. The contact was brief, but it sent a ripple through me, like a line had been crossed without anyone acknowledging it. Her gaze held mine, and for a moment, neither of us said anything. The silence wasn't empty. It was charged, thick with the weight of everything unspoken. She took a small step back, her expression unreadable. "You're sweet," she said softly. "Don't lose that. It's rare." Before I could respond, the sound of a car pulling into the driveway shattered the moment. Her posture stiffened, and without another word, she turned and slipped out of the room, leaving me frozen in place and grappling with everything that had just happened. The door closed behind her, but the weight of what had just happened didn't leave with her. I sat there, staring blankly at the wall, trying to process everything. My thoughts were a whirlwind, confusion, guilt, and a lingering feeling I couldn't quite name. It felt wrong, but at the same time, I couldn't ignore the pull of curiosity that kept tugging at me. A few minutes later, I heard the front door open, followed by my friend's familiar voice calling out, He was back, oblivious to the storm of emotions I was sitting in. I quickly tried to compose myself, forcing a casual expression as he entered the room. "Hey, sorry I took so long," he said, dropping his bag onto the floor. "Everything good here?" "Yeah," I replied, my voice a little too quick, a little too forced. "Everything's fine." He didn't seem to notice, too busy pulling out his phone and scrolling through messages. I sat there, watching him, the weight of what had just happened pressing down on me. Should I say something? Was there even anything to say? Nothing had really happened. But it had. Dinner that evening was a blur. She was there, smiling and chatting with her son like nothing had changed. Her laugh was light, her demeanor warm and inviting, just like it had been before. But every now and then, her eyes would flicker to mine, and I'd feel that same unspoken tension all over again. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but I knew it was there. I couldn't bring myself to look at her for too long, afraid that someone might notice the strange energy between us. My friend didn't seem to pick up on anything, too focused on recounting some story from his errands, but I could barely focus on his words. Every movement she made, every glance, felt magnified. After dinner, I excused myself early, claiming I was tired. Back in the room, I lay on the bed staring at the ceiling, replaying every moment in my head. What did it all mean? Had I misread her intentions? Or was there something deliberate about her actions? And if it was deliberate, what did she expect from me? I thought about telling my friend, but the idea felt impossible. How could I explain something so vague, so wrapped in subtlety and implication? What if he didn't believe me, or worse, what if he did? The thought of ruining our friendship over something like this made my stomach churn. The next morning, everything felt normal on the surface, but the undercurrent of tension hadn't disappeared. She greeted me with the same warm smile, asked if I'd slept well, and even offered to make me breakfast. To anyone else, it would have seemed like the kind of hospitality she'd shown all along. But I couldn't shake the feeling that there was more beneath the surface, hidden just out of reach. When it was finally time for me to leave, she stood by the door as my friend walked me out. Her goodbye was polite, friendly, the same as it had been when I first arrived. But as I turned to leave, I caught one last glance from her, a look that said everything and nothing all at once. It stayed with me long after I walked out the door, a reminder of a moment I couldn't forget, no matter how hard I tried.